Hello, everyone. I'm so sorry that I'm not there with you today, but Gabe had this idea of my reading from my book and sending you this video, so that's what I'm doing. I apologize for not being around, but I'm going to be reading from my novel, Gun Dealer's Daughter. I understand that there are some copies there, and that's the book that I hope to read. As you can see behind me, I have here all of the books a lot of the books that I use to research on my work because I've been doing a lot of work on history, the history of the Philippines, the Spanish, the war against the Spanish, the war against the Americans. And so if you see behind me that these are some of the books, I'll show you some of them. So I did a lot of work on Jose Rizal and thinking about Rizal as a writer rather than as a hero. And so these are some of the books that I have. I have this one here. That's the facsimile version of the El Filibusterismo, which is my favorite among Rizal's novels. Looked at to read about the Balangiga massacre in Samar, which is the subject of my next novel, the novel that's coming out in the fall. But all of these are books on the Philippine Revolution against Spain. I thought I'd show it to you anyway, since it's something that I wouldn't be able to show you if I were in fact in Anchorage. And for me as a writer, thinking about Philippine history, thinking about the relationship of our contemporary time to the history that we tend to forget, we tend not to really link the ways history um, can tell us something about the issues we have right now, let's say the Duterte government or the Marcos government that we had, that Duterte government seems to be copying in some ways, or ways in which we can think about ourselves, why we are here in America, the Filipino Americans, and to connect that history to our presence in Alaska, our presence in Seattle, our presence in New York. And I think history for me as a writer allows me to think about um, some way making something coherent about the seemingly displaced and as they call it, diasporic life that we do live now in the United States. So I just thought I'd show you some of these history books because they are really what drives me to write a lot, to think about the past and how it reflects on our present. So I'm going to read right now from Gun Dealer's Daughter. This was published, I think, 2012. I'll just start with the book. Uncle Johnny met the girl at Nice airport. He held her by the hand as light bulbs flashed. Revise that, not hand. By the sleeve. He held me by the sleeve gently. There was something awkward about my arrival, my stooped, discordant figure, my bandaged, gauzed lump of hands. A cordon held curious onlookers at bay, and a film crew, Gallic and impervious, skinny tilting men in black, strode about my cleared path. I moved along the cleared up space of an orchestrated welcome, following the straight line of a utility rope. I stumbled. I kicked the shin of a blond gaffer on bent knee, a gopher pulling tape from the floor. A commercial, Uncle Johnny muttered. I shivered as a door blew open. A light bulb blinded me. I felt someone rushing behind me, a lady walking a dog, a cripple with a parasol. My suddenly myopic eyes distinguished a lame man's fleshy elbows. Or was it a leash? Uncle Johnny tightened his grip and, almost dragging me by an armpit, moved me quickly along. And in a cutting room somewhere, freeze-framed, on the margins of that black-clad crowd posing to sell condoms or perfume, a girl's stricken face, my gaze, looks down, denying evidence of its arrival, gaunt-cheeked and hollow-eyed. No questions asked, no thoughts pursued. The days in a winter town in the south of France were a blur of boats, medicated recall. My bandaged hands held me back, a drugged drag. I watched the gauze on my wrists fray, a gray wispy itch. By the look of our lodgings, it had not been planned. The place was not worthy of Uncle Johnny. Uncovered beams, rough wood. This cramped place by the water in a narrow street, overlooking a threaded sea, was, I thought, pretty. But Uncle Johnny raised an eyebrow at its crude renovation. The room was whitewashed. Brown timber framed the paint. Sometimes the white walls seemed to reflect the silver sea, its glints, its undulating glare. You could see the boats from a window, cutouts in a livid blue. I watched the angled play of masts, the modest geometries of massive hulls waiting for domestic ghosts, winter boats moored for pleasure. Wrinkled caretakers appeared amidship, smoking joints and dragging rope. I noted names and origins, boats from Guernsey and Oporto. None of the names struck my fancy, though one was a namesake. Blue and sunless, Sol, a gloomy sloop, dingy dinghy. Unappetizing clothes, denims, a hat, underwear, flapped, drying on her deck. When Uncle Johnny learned from one of the caretakers, a youngish sailor with receding hair, that I wished to know, in broken French, how my services could be of use, laundering or scrubbing, not for pay, just for board, once the yacht left the marina, Uncle Johnny took me away. First we had that scene, the drama on the jetty. Uncle Johnny had been walking along the stones, the lank seaweeds, and there I walked beyond him. He could not see. He was looking at the horizon, at the green jutting rocks. I walked until I reached the end, and in a muddled move, I made the leap, a deep, chilling immersion. I tried to sink in the Mediterranean, which was hard to do. I am no Ophelia. I'm a floater. It was my second escape. I had tried it in Manila, with broad, stupid knives, big, messy gashes, a knotted misery in my wrists, hullabaloo in the hallway. It was the maids who saved me, a stampede from the kitchen. It is hard to die in a house full of servants. All I have to show for my remorse, my dead feelings, this shallow well of scars. So this is the opening of this book. The main character is named Sol, and she finds herself unable to remember the life she had before, as she is locked. She's in a medical facility in France, and then she's moved by her parents to this mansion in New York, and she can't figure out what happened to her, what happened to her life. She 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 wants to die. She doesn't know why she wants to die. She doesn't know why her life is so. She has a sense of horror in her life. And she tries to remember what her life was. She finds herself getting stuck, getting stuck in remembering um, this life in Manila that she had. When she gets to New York, the mansion in New York, um, she wanders around trying to figure out why she's kind of being kept. Not so much, she's not a prisoner, but she can't figure out why she's there. Um, she says this about her life in this mansion in New York. My nurses, knowing my habits now, leave me alone. When I opened the drawers in the library, somehow I knew what I would find. I remember as a kid wondering what these scrolls were for. On the mantelpiece, a redundant oleograph reproduced the room's view, but I had no memory of drawing my childish name on the cheap print. My signature spoiled its bottom right corner. A loop of S's scratched the view of cows, chewing cud and upset a pair of precisely drawn pigs on the painting. My mom in her high heels click-clacking down the Grecian parquet with the lady who had first enumerated this house's gifts. The secret doors for the servants. The ram's head sculpted into cabinets. I noted how she introduced all the novelties with a definite article. She pointed out where we could put a trampoline in the music room and a playground on the lawn. We must have lived here for a spell, deep in the 70s, when the country was in tumult, a new regime installed, after the awful pall of martial law in 1972, when the demand for their goods was at its height and the money came flowing in. My parents relocated to America until the mobs died down. I was a child. I was a martial law baby. A hyperactive bundle, too quick for my yaya, Manang Maring, who seemed old even then. I tortured her on the double staircase, leaping down one side before she had the chance to climb up the other, and doing it again before she could catch her breath. Now I know the entire house has a dizzying design. The staircase has a twin, and so does the oriel window, and the Grecian keys on one side of the room can be trusted to find themselves again on the other. As a child, I raced through the vaults and the niches and the fireplaces and the bays of this rambling, everlasting, hide-and-seek place, poking and giggling and running about, while the flustered servants called out my name. And in the meantime, on the other side of the mirror, in another continent, my country raged. I don't know exactly when we returned to the Philippines, and my parents sent me back to school in Makati, but I know we came back here to this mansion off and on for summer vacations, for trips with Uncle Johnny, to visit museums, parks, and churches in the city. I know it was he who installed soccer posts parallel to the spiral driveway, and the ball would fall as it would into the flowers by the porte cochere. I imagined everything in the house must be as it was then. Even the rusty goalposts must hang about, forlorn without their netting, if one peered beyond the Guastavino entrance, to the lawn enclosure rolling toward the street. But the house's vacancy disturbs me, its enormous solitude. Why am I still here? So she starts, her comes back, and what she remembers are some scenes in Manila. And so this is one of the scenes that she remembers. And for those of you who may know something about the 1970s, this particular place is the cultural center. So she's driving into the cultural center, and it's a concert that she sees, that she watches with her parents. It must have been Manong Babe who drove us to that entrance, facing the water. Already you could see it, the tale of a different city, beyond the bleakness of scheduled failure. We passed the blackouts of Manila streets, a regulated system of select disrepair. By the water, gowned, crowned women were alighting from their cars, sweeping onto the sidewalk. Even if it was easier to park first and walk across the street, no one bothered. Limousines waited in line by the sidewalk, drivers idling as all the idle matrons of Manila disembarked. Ladies in Manila do not walk. I have never seen my mother, Reina Elena Soliman, the former Queenie Kirolf, cross the street. I recognized Mrs. Esdrújula, the stateliest lady in society, emerging from a car a few feet away. She was wearing her single-lined blue tiara. She had begun to wear it ever since she had been knighted by the Pope. It was a sweet indulgence, granted for her gifts of new money to old charities. In return for her saintliness, she got to wear a crown of her own design, with subtle celestial symbols and utterly terrestrial stones. "Dear Bum Bum," my mother murmured as she spied her old friend, Mrs. Esdrújula. Madam Babe got out to open my mother's door. "Doesn't she look so saintly, just like Saint Catherine of Siena?" I did not remind my mother of the actual fate of her worshipped and beheaded saint. We had seen it one summer on a trip, a face visibly decaying against sweating glass. My mother had shrieked in the cathedral, "Oh my God, he died, the saint is rotting!" A guard had shushed her in Italian. Annabel, Bum Bum, Esdrújula obviously much better preserved than her patron saint. Her legendary slanting cat's eyes could be duplicated by no amount of surgery, approached us with her retinue. Guards with guns preceded her, and guards with rifles marked her egress. A maid walked behind her, carrying her towels. In only one thing was Madame Bum Bum Esdrújula unfortunate. She was always perspiring like a pig, a porous animal, the single miserable aspect of her genes, her Basque pedigree, or was it Alsatian? Her origins, in fact, were inscrutable, though impeccable. Her malady required a ritual of prevention, this tidy, ingenious parade with towels and a maid. It was a curious thing to see this magnificent woman followed everywhere by the white uniformed girl who bore white folded monogrammed towels, three at a time, like some latter-day midget page in Francisco Goya. Sometimes this maid, forgetting the occasion, would go about in rubber slippers, flip-flopping, adding to a glamorous event a comic chinellas genius. When Mrs. Esdrújula stopped in progress, the maid knew what to do. She came up and swiped at the famous clavicle while Mrs. Esdrújula bent to her delicate ablutions. The process of guards stopped to watch. The expert procedure required the maid's ginger knowledge of the limits of foundation cream and how to dab precisely at fine, etiolated, clammy skin. My mother tiptoed to kiss Bum Bum on the cheek, beso beso, left and right. These rituals are not useless. They made a public comment without need for words, expressing personal regard with restraint, and, in some cases, contempt without bloodshed. I followed my mother out of the car. Manong Babe held the door open, winking at me. "What is it, Babe?" Ma said to him, turning back to look at us. "Are you ill?" She was sharp-eyed, my mom. Nothing missed her evil eye. Manong Babe climbed back into the car. Ma introduced me again to Mrs. Esdrújula. I was, in fact, several inches taller than she was. I calculated that barefoot Mrs. Esdrújula was really only slightly taller than my mother, who was not quite 5 feet in her heels. That must be the mark of these ladies' stature, I thought, as I kissed her moist face. Madame Bum Bum was not quite life-size, but she could fake it. Mrs. Esdrújula barely touched my cheek, and I inhaled her fragrance as she turned away. "Ah, chica, you are now so large." "Queenie, how scary. Your daughter is a lady now." She said this to the air, to a portion of Manila Bay, while she tenderly touched a part of her cheek, as if to make sure it was still there, uncorrupted by affection. We walked toward my father on the sidewalk. He was chatting with Mrs. Esdrújula, her husband, a nondescript bald man. Mr. Esdrújula outsmarted God by his plainness. A minister without portfolio, the secretary, as he was called, was a man whose face you never remembered. The incredible ordinariness of the secretary's face, the dull features that lent itself to no caricaturist's wit, the extremely cipherly quality of his presence, clearly, birth had given him an advance ticket for oblivion. No one knew who he was, except the shrewdest of operators. There were rumors, of course, but in such a minor key, no one thought of them twice. That he was the biggest gun dealer in the country, that he whispered in the leader's ear the occult plans for years of ruthless rule, that he was a foundling child, an orphan with a bloodlust, or was he the bastard son of a basket case? It was not clear. The mumbo-jumbo of the times. What I knew was that he was the same age as my father. They had gone to school together. As a child, I called him Uncle. I used to interview him for social studies reports, and once, for an English assignment based on Studs Terkel's book, Working, he gave me a first-hand account of what he did day to day, just like the bank clerks and the bellhops in the book. He drank milk, signed forms, took naps. The fateful trip that Pa had taken to scout the environs around San Juanico Strait, where Pa had first laid eyes on Queenie Carol, the rose seller's daughter, a sprite in a garden that was soon to be bulldozed for history to make way for the longest bridge in Asia, San Juanico Bridge. That trip had the mark of the secretary on it. Not the least of the projects of the least of the provinces in the Republic of the Philippines did not know the cool, dry handshake of this nondescript man. the exact features of whose face already escaped me, a clean, mild-mannered blur in the night. Along Rojas Boulevard, the women continued toward the concert hall, white lit. I recognized them from my parents' eternal dinner parties. They wobbled in tight ternos, butterfly sleeves sagging from the weight of stones. I waved to someone at the ticket booth, Mrs. Liano. Soon enough, I found my parents. They had found their center, the group for which my parents reserved their charms. I recognized some people, politicians, a man who controlled an agrarian monopoly, pineapples or peanuts, a few choice foreign businessmen, diplomats, and generals. And there was Don Mariano and his corseted lady among them. I'm going to skip a few pages. They had found their man. It was a family business, our friendly art. I knew on these occasions they always had a specific target. Ma and Pa fluttered from one person to the next, as if to allow some time for their prey to relax and think itself out of danger. "So, what do you collect?" I asked the American. "Coins," he said. He was very bald. A chandelier shone on him with unadvised relish. He was fidgety in his barong, a gossamer shirt in tune with the occasion, appropriately appliqued with insect wings. "He's from Connecticut or Colorado," Don Mariano intoned. The colonel's taut, pink-skinned body, like a sorry piglet in piña fiber, uneasily filled his dress shirt's transparent gauze. I was afraid the piña would split, destroying the shirt's fine filigree. "I collect Byzantine coins, really," he said, and he bowed his head at us, looking briefly at my mother, and I don't know if I imagined this, as if with a look of disgust. But he introduced us to the lady beside him, his wife, as they waited for us to move ahead. My mother wouldn't budge. She nudged me. So I said, "Do you collect them? The solidae, I mean? Pardon, is that the plural form of the word?" I noticed the young wife looking away. I thought she was not that much older than I, except that if you looked again, you'd notice the waist and arms of a woman who had just had a child, a wide-eyed blonde thickening into womanhood. Her husband, Colonel Greer, when you glanced more closely at him, had a formidable presence despite his smallish height. He had a frame like a shuttered bungalow, a rectangular bulk with massive shoulders. His arms were crossed against his chest. I couldn't help it. I stared. His gauzy barong revealed a crisscross of keloids, a jungle of scars all along his biceps' raw length. I looked at his face. "I suppose the most common coins might come from the time of Anacomemna during the reign of her father, Alexius I. He changed the Eastern monetary system, I believe." "You are talking about late Byzantium," he said. "You're right." The colonel looked surprised, as well he might. I always thought my forms of knowledge were a kind of autism, the sign of my indifference to more important things. I collected bits and pieces of useless information, biblical parables, grammatical games, a flotsam of historic details, a rattling can of artistic arcana. It endeared me to no one. He leaned toward me. His physical parts began to cohere, but the tenor of his interest confused me. "You know your history, I see," he said. "Are you one of those feminists who wants to raise Anacomemna from the grave?" "Oh, no, sir, I am not," I said. "I'm researching the Byzantines for a project in history. I've always liked them. They're weird." "Well, that's too bad," he said. "I like Anacomemna. Have you read the Alexiad?" "No. My coins are not as valuable as those." "From the reign of the Asiatic emperor, the child king, Elagabalus?" "Oh, no, 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 no," said the colonel. "No coins from Elagabalus. I'll have nothing to do with Oriental freaks." He smiled. "Anyway, I'd need to quit my job if I got one of those." "What a shame that would be," said my mother. "You have just taken up an excellent position here in Manila. Inday! He's with Tom at Lotus, with our own General Tom." "It would be a full-time job guarding a rarity of a coin like that," the colonel continued. "So," he said to me, "you have a mind for ancient history." "Only pieces of history, I'm afraid," I said. "Obscure little things. Useless knowledge." "Oh, you don't know my daughter, Colonel Greer. She wants to be a historical scholar, would you believe?" said my mother. She took my shoulders and held me before her so that I was walking beside the colonel like a puppet being moved, and I let her. For a minute I was pleased to lean against my mother's firm hands. The by the bulge of the crowd in the far corner of the lobby, a kind of rippling that predicted a greater requirement of space somewhere else, you could tell that someone had finally arrived. Well, the band's all here, said Colonel Greer. Shall we move on into the concert? And in the mob of bodies, I believe I gathered his version of history. He said to me, "It is not useless knowledge. You never know what one can do with knowledge of the past given the chance. As a prisoner in Vietnam, I can tell you I used it to my advantage. My knowledge of history. I can show you my coin collection. I have many Filipino coins. I studied it, you know, your history, the Philippine insurrection against the Americans. An interesting affair. You mean the tail end of our revolution? The Filipino-American War in 1899, I said. Correct, he smiled. That small matter in the Spanish-American War, a side dish, you might say, to a more significant feast. His ironic salute melds into a stereographic double of iconic Americans in my academic memory. Military Governor of Manila, Arthur MacArthur, and his returning swashbuckling son, General Douglas, William Howard Taft, the first and fattest gringo governor of the Philippine Islands, William McKinley, presider over the American invasion, aptly assassinated by anarchists. This American provoked me into pedantry, and I found a note in my voice that I hated in others. That was no insurrection, Colonel, I answered. We were fighting a war against your enemy. You said you came to help us, in the name of democracy, to free ourselves from tyrannical Spain. Instead, you invaded. In the Treaty of Paris, you paid $20 million to buy our islands from the already vanquished Spain. We resisted you. Your army killed 600,000 Filipinos from 1899 to 1902, a war worse than Vietnam. That was no insurrection, Colonel. That was our war of independence. Which you lost, the man grinned at me. We won. You forget that point. And the American moved on before I could gather the wit to reply. So I think one can guess from those pages that her parents are not their business is not very good. Her parents are gun dealers who are contractors, military contractors who supply the regime of Ferdinand Marcos with guns for his army. As you know, usually the guns that the Philippines gets from for its army are from the United States, but there are private arms dealers who like to who might have who work with the U.S. Army, you know, with the U.S. military and with Filipino bureaucrats who might get a take on the selling, and so her family is one of those very big time contractors that sell guns. And as you know, that's very problematic for a military dictatorship because the guns end up killing protesters, student activists, labor leaders, farmers who want their fair share of for their labor. So during the Marcos regime, around around 3,000 were killed by the Marcos regime, and 70,000 people were imprisoned and tortured. So in that around 14-year span of of martial law, I'm not including the time that Marcos was in power before 1972. So during that time, Marcos killed 3,000, imprisoned and tortured 70,000, and people are still trying to get some reparation for that. And as we know, we have we have a government that's already killed around 12,000 people. Duterte supposedly doesn't kill the student activists. He's killing what he considers criminals, but the horror of that killing quite is really interesting if you think about the 1965 to 1986 rule of Marcos. Within a year, Duterte has killed more than 3 times the people Marcus killed. Um, this novel does not talk about the current regime. Obviously, it talks about martial law, and this girl Saul gets involved with a bunch of revolutionaries who want to use her connections to guns to create chaos. They in fact try to. It's an assassination plot that actually happened in Manila in 1989, not 1980, which is when this book was set. And I can talk a little bit more about that time and that regime in in the next event that I'm doing in Anchorage, uh, and um, and I'm hoping that some of you can get to that event. I'm really sorry not to be there for this one. I can give you one more section of the novel where Saul is angry with her boyfriend who's trying to recruit her to help give them guns for their interesting project. So this is a conversation with Jed, who is her boyfriend, and he is actually, interestingly, the son of one of her parents' friends, Don Mariano, who is a middleman between the military contractors and the government. Um, and and his father is one of the wealthiest men in the Philippines, actually wealthier than the family of Saul, who are quite weirdly wealthy, as you can imagine. Gun dealers might be. They're not just gun dealers; they're not gun runners. They are arms traders. You've been avoiding me. He was staring down from an amused height. No, I said. Let's talk. Why won't you talk to me? He lowered himself. He sat on his haunches at my feet. The heels of his sandals were raised from the ground. They were worn out now, the heels ground up. How long had it been? 6 months? June to December. I had lived an entire life in an interim universe, and it was odd to see it whittled down like this, easily measured by the stumps on his shoes. Talk to me, he said. I looked away, at the door, at the burnt board guard. Then I stared at him. Remember I said that night? When the police officer came and you took out your wallet and you showed him your name? Remember? He took out a cigarette and started twiddling with it. We got lucky, he said. I shook my head. That's when I knew. What? That I could not be a part. Of what? That I was just playing a game. That I was not honest. I don't mean about us. About my part in this country. That I could never be like Solly. I could never really join. Solly is her friend who is a student activist. She's an organizer of student rallies at the University of the Philippines in Diliman. What are you talking about? That guard saluted you, Jed. Don't you see? We live outside the country's rules. We can do whatever we want. We can commit crimes. We can even play at revolution. We could kill people for all we knew, and then in the end, we will always get away. We're cockroaches. It's we who are the problem. Jed, don't you see? Speak for yourself. I'm no cockroach. I'm going to be part of the solution. No, you're not. Your fucking family has fucked this country up. You and your family and your goddamn hold on the countryside, I mean, you guys own goddamn Bukidnon or something. You will never be a part. You will always be the problem. He crushed the empty packet and he took out the matches for a cigarette. His hands were absolutely sure of their gestures. He stroked, burned, lit. He spoke amid the smoke. Does it matter anyhow where we come from, Saul? If we end up on the right side anyway? Saul? Saul for solipsism. That is what Edwin calls me. At that Jed smiled. He touched my cheek, blowing his smoke the other way. I shook my head away from him. No, Saul, he said. Don't you see? Saul for solution. Don't you see the role we can play? I know it will always be easy for us. The policeman couldn't even arrest us. But he was an idiot. Don't you think I don't think about it every fucking day? That we could have been caught and it would have been my fault. What is our country's history? What has happened again and again? What was the failure of Simon? Jed was fierce in the daylight, face quivering in the haze, though maybe that was only a trick of the smoke about his face. You know, the hero of El Filibusterismo, a diabolical creature just like us, addle-brained member of the upper class. But Saul, even he was on the side of the good. He failed, but he tried. We do have a role to play. We simply have to make a choice. We must choose to be a part. No, I said. We will always have our wealth. We will always have our names. There is something suspicious, dishonest, in play-acting revolt. We're cockroaches. We'll outlast even our crimes. We can give them up, he said. Our wealth, our names. Will you? Will you give up your family, your mother, your home? Well, no need to be absolutist. Give yourself a break, Saul. You know the world's evils are not your fault. At that I laughed. He took my face in his hands. I was scared that night when the policeman came. You did not look it. I was scared. For you, chauvinist bullshit, I said. He did not laugh. I was scared. I always knew it would happen. I knew I would do it. Do what? That one day I would get you into trouble, and you would do whatever I wanted. No, I said. No, I won't. I shook myself out of his hands. I started moving away. Yes, you will, Saul. Solve for solution. I'll see you during break. Jed disappeared. He didn't linger. When he saw me with this other friend, Sally Vega, as I pumped her with questions, I knew she wouldn't answer, just as long as I had the excuse to turn away from Jed's certainty that yes, one day I would succumb. So there, maybe that gives you a clue about what happens later on and whether or not she does decide to go with Jed's plot, and maybe you can get a clue of I don't know what happened to her at the end, because the beginning of the novel tells us something about what may have happened at the end. But I won't give away the rest of the plot. I hope that I see you at the next event. And again, so sorry. If you have any questions, I'll be there on the for the Filipino American History Month event on Sunday. Thank you.